Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to discuss growing points in plants. There's a big difference between different plants. We're standing in a cornfield right here, and that's completely different than soybeans.
Well, when we look at corn, it's a grass crop, and grass crops have one growing point per plant. So this corn here, if I clipped it off of the ground, Brian, is it going to die or is it going to live? That's the question a lot of people have.
Okay, so this growing point on a corn plant, or really on any grass plant, it's going to be below the ground initially, and it's always wrapped up inside all these leaves and stem and everything else, but it will be above ground level when the corn reaches about 6 to 8 inches tall. What that growing point eventually becomes in the corn plant is the tassel.
Now with broadleaves, it's a totally different thing. Like soybeans, for example, as soon as you see something above ground, what are you looking at? You're looking at the growing points. The first thing that comes out of the ground on a soybean plant are the two halves of the seed, and each one of those has a growing point. So as that soybean plant comes up, if anything happens, maybe you get some hail, maybe you have some wind that's blowing sand particles across the surface of the soil that cut those plants off, or if you have a bug that comes and chews that plant off, if you've broken off the above ground part of the plant, that soybean or that broadleaf plant is dead.
So where those growing points are on a broadleaf plant like soybeans, for example, or sunflowers, is basically at every stem that attaches to the main stem. That's where you're going to find the growing points. So on a soybean plant that, let's say, has 20 leaves on it, you might have 10, 12 growing points on there. And also, when you look real close at the top of the plant, there are usually about 3 growing points that are all tight in that center. So before the soybean plant reaches maximum height, you can count, and every stem that's going to attach to the main stem, plus about 3 more growing points up at the top of the plant, boy, it ends up being a lot of growing points.
Now, we're approaching this, of course, from a desirable plant standpoint where we want to keep these plants alive, and we're kind of talking about, all right, you know, if your plant's going to survive, here's how it works. But when we think about weed control, we're also curious about where those growing points are. Now, Brian and I are talking about annual plants like corn and soybeans, for example, and many of the weeds that we're trying to control in our fields are annuals, and so those growing points are eventually going to be above ground. With perennials, those growing points can also be below ground, which makes them much more difficult to control.
Yeah, so in other words, there's a perennial root system, a big root system down below ground, and those growing points actually can extend way out and put up more plants, maybe 5, 10 feet away from the main plant. So in that particular case, when we start talking about weed control, it's going to take a lot of herbicide because I got to get these growing points here under control and growing points that might be 5 feet away under control. You can see that the dose has to be much higher than what we're dealing with for an annual plant in a lot of cases.
You may be thinking, well, wait a minute, what if I don't want to use a herbicide? What if I just want to go do some tillage? What if I get my hoe out? Or what if I have a tractor and I'm going to do some full-scale tillage through this area?
It doesn't matter if you're doing tillage or you're using herbicide. The point is you've got to get every single growing point under control. It's got to be dead. Otherwise, you're still going to have a plant that's alive. So what happens a lot of time, like with the perennial weeds, let's take Canada thistle, for example. You might go out there with your hoe and you say, oh yeah, I got the growing points. I killed this plant here. But what you don't see is that root system below ground that has some growing points. You needed to get below ground and pull that entire root system out to get every single growing point. Otherwise, you're just going to have more plants popping up later.
Well, growing points are certainly important for everyone to understand if you're trying to grow.
Oh, wait a second, Darren. You left out one of my favorite things to talk about, and that's Roundup. We talk about Roundup resistant weeds all the time. If you want to get a complete kill with Roundup, what you have to do is make sure you have a lethal dose in order to kill every growing point going down. So let's take lamb's quarters, for example, one of our favorite weeds to talk about here in Ag PhD. A lot of times what we see is guys use a rate of Roundup that's enough to kill 18 growing points up above, but they miss 2 growing points down below. And what ends up happening is then that plant just branches out and it continues growing. Well, with Roundup, it's not the fact that lamb's quarters is resistant to Roundup, it's just the fact that we needed a stronger dose. And especially when the weather is cool and Roundup works a little slower in the plant, you've got to up that rate as much as you can in order to have a lethal dose to kill every single growing point in order for that lamb's quarters plant to die.
Wow, this got to be a big discussion, didn't it, Brian?
Well, it's fun. I like talking about this growing point thing because it's something that a lot of people don't even think about. And unfortunately, our Weed of the Week also can have quite a few growing points. Can you identify this week's weed?